My name is Charlotte Reed, and on what should have been the happiest day of my life, I stood alone at the altar while my parents sat in the front row of my sister Vanessa's corporate promotion ceremony. 3 years later, as the family attorney, read my father's will, I discovered the truth that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. At 32, I believed I had constructed the perfect life through determination and relentless hard work. I had graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern, earned my MBA from Wharton, and secured a position at Meridian Consulting that most professionals would sacrifice a decade of their careers to obtain. My corner office on the 38th floor overlooked Lake Michigan, a daily reminder of how far I had come from the middle-class Chicago suburb where I grew up. My professional accomplishments were matched by what appeared to be an equally successful personal life. After a careful 5-year relationship, James had proposed at Christmas time with a 2-carat emerald-cut diamond that perfectly suited my understated aesthetic. We had purchased a renovated brownstone in Lincoln Park, nothing ostentatious, but elegant and within walking distance of the best restaurants in the city. We planned our wedding with the same precision I applied to client acquisitions: a spring ceremony at the Chicago Botanical Gardens, 200 carefully selected guests, a respected string quartet, and a photographer who had worked for Vogue. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Everything except my family. The Reeds had always been what outsiders might call achievement-oriented. My father, Richard, had built Reed Manufacturing from a small workshop into a regional powerhouse that supplied specialized components to the automotive industry. He measured success in concrete terms: revenue growth, market expansion, acquisition of competitors. My mother, Eleanor, complemented his business acumen with social currency. She sat on the boards of 3 cultural organizations and had chaired the hospital charity gala for 5 consecutive years. Between them, they had created a household. Where accomplishment wasn't celebrated, it was expected. My younger sister Vanessa and I had absorbed this ethos from our earliest years. Our childhood bedrooms were decorated not with pop star posters but with framed honor roll certificates. Dinner conversations revolved around progress reports, grade point averages, extracurricular achievements, competition placements. A 94% on a calculus test would be met not with praise, but with questions about the missing 6%. As children, Vanessa and I had been allies against this pressure, whispering support to each other after particularly difficult parental performance reviews. But something shifted during our college years. While I remained steadfastly on the path my parents had charted, prestigious degrees, corporate advancement, appropriate social connections, Vanessa began to drift. She changed her major 3 times, eventually settling on communications rather than the business degree my father had expected. She spent a semester abroad in Barcelona, returning with what my mother called bohemian tendencies and a boyfriend with an uncategorizable accent. Her career path after graduation was equally baffling to my parents: a position with a small marketing firm that specialized in nonprofit clients, followed by a stint with an environmental advocacy group. "She's finding herself," I would explain, diplomatically when family friends inquired about Vanessa's latest professional pivot. But privately, I wondered if she was intentionally positioning herself as my opposite: the free spirit to my structured pragmatist, the creative to my analytical strategist. Our relationship had grown increasingly strained. Our monthly sister lunches became quarterly, then semi-annual obligations. Conversations that once flowed easily began to feel like navigating a field of conversational landmines. She would make subtle comments about my corporate drone existence. I would counter with pointed questions about her financial security and retirement planning. Despite this growing distance, when James and I set our wedding date, Vanessa was my automatic choice for maid of honor. Whatever our differences, we were sisters, blood, family. Some bonds transcended ideological divides or lifestyle choices. I delivered her invitation personally, meeting her for coffee at an artisanal cafe in Wicker Park that served pour-overs in ceramic vessels that looked like science experiments. "I'd be honored," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. For a moment, I glimpsed the sister I remembered before adult life had pulled us in different directions. "Mom and Dad will be thrilled," I replied, feeling a surge of hope that my wedding might finally be the event that reunited our fragmented family. Vanessa's expression shifted subtly. "Have they mentioned my promotion yet?" I blinked in confusion. "Promotion? No, they haven't said anything." She nodded, a familiar resignation settling over her features. "I didn't think so. The environmental group I've been consulting for offered me a full-time position as their director of community engagement. It's a huge step up, my own office, a staff of 4, a budget to actually implement the programs I've been designing." "That's wonderful," I said, genuinely pleased for her. "When did this happen?" 2 weeks ago. I called Mom and Dad immediately." She traced the rim of her coffee cup with her finger. "Dad said it was nice to see some ambition finally surfacing." His dismissive response stung even in secondhand retelling. "He just doesn't understand work that isn't tied to profit margins," I offered as consolation. "Maybe." She took a sip of her coffee. "Anyway, there's a formal ceremony and reception. The foundation's major donors will be there, along with some local politicians. It's on May 15th. My stomach dropped. "Vanessa, that's my wedding day." Her eyes widened. "No, your save-the-date said May 22nd. I pulled out my phone, opening my calendar. "We moved it up a week because the botanical gardens had a cancellation. I sent an update email last month." I showed her the screen, where May 15th was prominently marked Wedding Day in bold letters. "I never got that email," she said, her voice hollow. "Charlotte, I can't change the promotion event. The governor's wife is presenting the awards, and her schedule determined the date." We stared at each other across the table, the implications settling between us. One of us would have to compromise, would have to sacrifice a milestone moment. The choice seemed obvious to me. My wedding had been planned for over a year, invitations had been sent, deposits had been paid. Surely Vanessa could accept her promotion certificate the following week, or have someone accept on her behalf. "I'll talk to my director," she said finally, though her tone suggested limited optimism. Relief washed over me. Crisis averted. "Thank you. You know how much it means to me to have you there." We parted with a hug that felt more genuine than any we'd shared in years. As I watched her walk away, her vintage leather messenger bag bouncing against her hip, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps this wedding really would be the beginning of a new chapter for all of us. That belief sustained me through the following weeks of final preparations. The caterer confirmed the menu. The florist sent samples of the centerpieces. The calligrapher delivered the place cards in an elegant script. James and I finalized our honeymoon plans. 2 weeks in New Zealand, a perfect blend of adventure and luxury. 3 weeks before the wedding, I called my parents to confirm details for the rehearsal dinner. My mother answered, her voice carrying the distracted quality that typically indicated she was simultaneously checking emails on her iPad. "Charlotte, darling, I was just about to call you. Your father and I need to discuss something with you. About the wedding." Her tone, too casual, too controlled, immediately triggered my concern. "What is it?" "It's about the date." She paused. "There's a conflict that's arisen." My grip tightened on the phone. "What kind of conflict?" "Vanessa's promotion ceremony. It's quite a significant achievement for her, being recognized by the governor's office. We feel we should be there to support her." The room seemed to tilt sideways. "Mom, my wedding is that day. You know this. We've been planning it for over a year." "Yes, well, these things happen." Her voice took on the brisk efficiency she used when handling logistical problems. "We wondered if you might consider moving your date, just by a week or two." I struggled to form words through my shock. Move my wedding? 3 weeks beforehand? That's impossible. We'd lose all our deposits. Venues are booked months in advance. People have made travel arrangements. Well, then perhaps James's parents could handle the hosting duties. They're lovely people. The casual dismissal of the most important day of my life left me breathless. "Mom, this is my wedding. You and Dad are supposed to be there. I'm your daughter." "And Vanessa is also our daughter," she countered, her voice cooling. "She's finally showing real career progress. We need to encourage that." The subtext was clear. My success was expected, unremarkable. Vanessa's success was fragile, requiring nurturing and attention. My achievements had never needed celebration because they followed the prescribed path. Vanessa's warranted special treatment precisely because they deviated from expectations. "I can't believe you're even considering missing my wedding," I said, hearing the tremor in my voice and hating it. "Please, talk to Dad. Make him understand. Your father and I are in complete agreement on this, Charlotte." Her tone softened, marginally. "You've always been our rock, so capable, so self-sufficient. Vanessa needs this support right now." The conversation ended without resolution, leaving me with the devastating realization that my wedding day, the culmination of years of planning and dreaming, might proceed without my parents in attendance. In the weeks that followed, I made desperate attempts to resolve the conflict. I called Vanessa, who claimed the ceremony couldn't be rescheduled. I appealed to my father directly, only to be told that I was being characteristically inflexible. I even looked into changing my own wedding date, despite the financial penalties and logistical nightmare it would create, only to find that no suitable venues were available on short notice. As the day approached, a terrible clarity settled over me. My parents had made their choice, and it wasn't me. Never me. I had been the reliable one, the successful one, the one who didn't need their validation or attention because I had always managed to succeed without it. In prioritizing Vanessa's moment over mine, they were simply continuing a pattern established years ago, one I had been too blind or too proud to recognize. The morning of my wedding dawned with picture-perfect weather, exactly as I had planned. My bridesmaids gathered in the preparation suite. Champagne flowed. The photographer captured candid moments of laughter and anticipation. If anyone noticed the absence of the mother of the bride during the traditional getting-ready rituals, they were kind enough not to mention it. James found me alone moments before the ceremony was to begin, still in my robe, staring out the window, at the gardens where white chairs were arranged in perfect rows, waiting for guests to fill them. "Charlotte," he said gently, breaking protocol by seeing me before the ceremony. "Your coordinator told me. I'm so sorry." I turned to him, this man who understood me better than anyone, who had never asked me to be less than I was. "They're not coming. They chose her. They've always chosen her." He took my hands in his. "Do you want to postpone? We can tell everyone there's been an emergency." For a moment, I considered it. Weighed the humiliation of canceling a wedding against the humiliation of walking down an aisle with no one to give me away. Then something inside me hardened. Throughout my life, I had achieved everything I set out to do. I had never allowed obstacles to deter me from my goals. This day, my wedding day, would be no different. "No," I said, straightening my shoulders. "The ceremony proceeds as planned." And so I walked myself down the aisle, alone, but unbowed, to marry the man I loved, surrounded by friends who had chosen to be there. If there were whispers about the empty seats in the front row, or about the bride who gave herself away, I didn't hear them. I was too focused on moving forward, as I always had. Later, as James and I swayed to our first dance, He whispered in my ear, "You're the strongest person I've ever known." I smiled up at him, conscious of the cameras capturing the moment, determined that every photo would show joy rather than the pain that threatened to crack my carefully composed exterior. "I've had to be," I replied. What I didn't say, what I couldn't say, even to him, was that in that moment, as everyone applauded the beautiful bride on her perfect day, I was making a silent vow that transcended the ones I had just exchanged. I was promising myself that I would never again arrange my life around earning the approval of people who had repeatedly demonstrated that it could not be earned. Not by achievement, not by success, not by perfect adherence to their expectations. My wedding day marked not just the beginning of my marriage, but the beginning of my emancipation from the need for parental validation that had driven me for 32 years. I just didn't know then how complete that emancipation would eventually become, or the price my parents would ultimately pay for their absence on the day when I needed them most. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The week following our wedding, James and I disappeared into the pristine wilderness of New Zealand's South Island. Cell reception was spotty, internet connections unreliable, exactly as we had planned it. For 14 days, we hiked through ancient forests, kayaked crystal-clear lakes, and fell asleep in luxury lodges with nothing but star-filled skies above us. I allowed myself to be fully present in each moment, refusing to let thoughts of my parents' absence contaminate this precious time. It was only on our return flight, somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, that reality began to seep back in. While James slept beside me, I opened my laptop and faced the backlog of emails that had accumulated during our digital detox. Among the work correspondence and congratulatory messages sat an email from my mother, sent 3 days after the wedding. Subject: Checking in Charlotte. I trust your ceremony proceeded smoothly despite our absence. Your father and I hope you understand that our decision was not made lightly. Family support must sometimes be allocated where it is most needed, and Vanessa's career has been in need of encouragement. The governor's wife personally commended Vanessa's work, and several potential donors expressed interest in her programs. It was a breakthrough moment for her, one that might not have happened had we not been present. I'm sure, given your professional success, you can appreciate the importance of such networking opportunities. Your father suggests a family dinner, when your schedule permits, to celebrate both your marriage and Vanessa's achievement. Please let us know when you're available. Love, Mom. I stared at the screen, reading and rereading those carefully composed paragraphs. Not an apology, not even close. Rather, a rationalization wrapped in the thinnest veneer of concern. The familiar ache began to spread through my chest again, that particular pain that came from realizing, yet again, that the love I craved had always been conditional. I closed the laptop without responding. The following Monday, I returned to Meridian Consulting, diving back into the comfortable patterns of my work life. My colleagues congratulated me on the wedding, admired my honeymoon photos, and tactfully avoided mentioning my parents' conspicuous absence from the professional quality wedding images I shared. 3 weeks after our return, a courier delivered a package to my office. Inside was a crystal vase from Tiffany & Co., accompanied by a card signed by both my parents. A belated wedding gift, no doubt selected by my mother's assistant from an appropriate catalog of suitable items for such occasions. I placed it on a shelf in my office and continued with my day. I didn't call to thank them. I didn't schedule the family dinner they had suggested. When my mother left voicemails, I deleted them without listening. When my father's number appeared on my caller ID, I sent it to voicemail. It wasn't a conscious strategy so much as a visceral response, the instinctive withdrawal of a repeatedly injured animal from the source of its pain. James noticed, of course. "Don't you think you should at least talk to them?" he asked one evening as I declined yet another call from my mother. And say what? I countered, setting down my phone with deliberate calm. Thank you for demonstrating so clearly where I stand in your priorities. I appreciate the confirmation. That 32 years of meeting your every expectation counts for nothing compared to Vanessa's one moment of conforming to your values. He reached across the kitchen island to take my hand. I'm not saying they deserve your forgiveness. I'm saying that this silence is consuming you. Every call you don't answer, every message you don't return, it's keeping you tethered to the hurt. He was right, but I wasn't ready to acknowledge it. The wound was still too fresh, the betrayal too profound. Instead, I threw myself into work with renewed intensity. I took on additional clients, volunteered for challenging projects, stayed at the office late into the evenings. Success had always been my refuge, the place where I felt confident and in control. Now I clung to it like a life raft in turbulent waters. 6 months after the wedding, Meridian announced a significant restructuring. The changes included a new position, Director of International Strategy, that would oversee the firm's expansion into emerging markets. It was a role that would require extensive travel, diplomatic finesse, and the ability to navigate complex cultural and regulatory landscapes. It was, in short, the exact challenge I needed. I submitted my application, prepared extensively for the interviews, and presented a comprehensive vision for the department's development. 2 weeks later, the CEO called me into his office to offer me the position. You were the unanimous choice, he said, sliding the offer letter across his desk. The board was particularly impressed by your 5-year growth strategy. Ambitious but achievable. Exactly the balance we need. The salary represented a 40% increase over my current compensation. The role came with a team of 12, direct reports, a discretionary budget that made my eyes widen, and the authority to shape Meridian's international presence for years to come. It was, by any objective measure, a career-defining opportunity. It would also require relocation to London for a minimum of 3 years. That evening, James and I sat on our rooftop deck, watching the Chicago skyline transition from day to night, as we discussed the implications of this potential move. Your practice can't relocate, I said, voicing the obvious obstacle. James had built a respected psychotherapy practice specializing in trauma recovery. His clients relied on the continuity of care he provided. Many had been working with him for years. True, he acknowledged. Not immediately. But there are options. I could transition some clients to trusted colleagues. Others might be willing to continue with telehealth sessions. And London certainly needs mental health professionals. I studied his face in the fading light. You'd be starting over professionally, building a new client base, navigating a different healthcare system, establishing credentials in a foreign country. I would, he agreed. But isn't that what partners do? Support each other's dreams, even when it requires sacrifice? His words hung in the air between us, carrying an unintentional barb. Isn't that what family does? Wasn't that exactly what my parents had failed to do? I don't want to uproot your life, I said finally. James reached for my hand, intertwining our fingers in that familiar way that always centered me. Charlotte, I didn't marry your career or your address. I married you. If London is where your path leads right now, then London is where we'll go. 2 months later, we sold our brownstone, packed our essentials into shipping containers, and boarded a one-way flight to Heathrow. The decision to accept the position had been made easier by the clean break it offered, a legitimate reason to put an ocean between myself and the family situation I had been avoiding. Before we left, I sent my parents a brief email informing them of our relocation. My mother responded immediately, expressing surprise at the suddenness of the decision and disappointment that we hadn't consulted them. She suggested a farewell dinner, a chance to mend fences before an extended separation. I declined, citing the hectic timeline of our move preparations. It wasn't entirely untrue. The logistics of international relocation were indeed overwhelming. But it wasn't the whole truth either. The reality was that I couldn't imagine sitting across a dinner table from them, maintaining polite conversation, while the unaddressed betrayal loomed like an unwelcome guest. London embraced us with its particular blend of history and innovation, tradition and progress. We found a flat in Marylebone with high ceilings and tall windows that filled the space. With natural light, James began the process of establishing his practice, starting with a small office share and a handful of expatriate clients. I immersed myself in my new role, building relationships with international partners, restructuring inefficient processes, and developing the expansion strategy I had promised in my interview. Months passed, then a year. My team delivered results that exceeded projections. James's practice grew steadily, his reputation spreading through word-of-mouth referrals. We explored our adopted city on weekends, discovering hidden gardens and centuries-old pubs, museums housing priceless artifacts, and markets selling local produce. We made friends, other expatriates, British colleagues, neighbors in our building. We created a life that was rich and full and entirely our own. Communication with my family dwindled to holiday greetings and the occasional updates about major life events. My mother emailed when Vanessa was promoted again, this time to executive director after her predecessor's retirement. My father sent a terse message when Reed Manufacturing acquired a competitor, expanding their market share significantly. I responded with appropriate congratulations but initiated no correspondence of my own. It wasn't hostility that maintained this distance so much as a gradual acceptance that the relationship I had longed for, one based on unconditional support and genuine interest in my life, had never existed and likely never would. The realization brought a peculiar kind of peace, the release that comes from abandoning an impossible quest. Then, 18 months into our London life, James answered a call from an unfamiliar number while we were preparing dinner in our flat. "Yes, this is James Reed," he said, giving me a puzzled glance. His expression shifted as he listened, concern replacing confusion. "I see. Yes, she's here." He handed me the phone. "It's your father's attorney." My hand trembled slightly as I took the phone. "This is Charlotte Reed." "Ms. Reed, I'm Robert Schwartz from Schwartz, Hamilton and Partners. I'm calling regarding your father, Richard Reed." His tone was professionally somber. "I'm afraid I have difficult news." The kitchen seemed to recede around me as I gripped the counter for support. "What's happened?" "Your father suffered a massive stroke 3 days ago. He was taken to Chicago Memorial Hospital, but the damage was extensive. I'm very sorry to inform you that he passed away this morning." The world tilted, reality suddenly unstable beneath my feet. My father, the imposing figure whose approval I had sought for decades, whose disappointment I had feared, whose absence at my wedding had created a wound that had never fully healed, was gone. Permanently, irrevocably gone. "Ms. Reed?" The attorney's voice pulled me back to the present. "Are you there?" "Yes," I managed. "I'm here." "I understand you're currently in London. Your mother has asked me to handle the funeral arrangements, which are scheduled for next Tuesday at Lakeside Memorial Gardens. There are also matters pertaining to your father's estate that will require your attention. As an executor named in his will, your presence will be needed for the formal reading." Executor. The word penetrated the fog of shock surrounding me. My father had named me an executor of his will, a position of responsibility and trust typically reserved for those closest to the deceased. "I'll book flights immediately," I heard myself say. After ending the call, I stood motionless in the center of our kitchen, trying to process the tumult of emotions crashing through me. Grief, regret, anger, confusion, and beneath it all, a terrible sense of finality. Whatever resolution I might have hoped for, whatever reconciliation might have been possible, those opportunities were now forever lost. James wrapped his arms around me, holding me as the first tears came. "I'm so sorry, Charlotte." "I don't even know what I'm crying for," I confessed against his shoulder. "The father I lost today, or the relationship I never had." "Both," he said softly. "It's allowed to be both." That night, as James researched flight options, I sat alone on our small balcony, watching the lights of London against the night sky. In 48 hours, I would be back in Chicago, facing not only my father's funeral, but also my mother and sister for the first time in nearly 2 years. I would stand beside them as we buried a complicated man who had shaped all our lives in profound and sometimes painful ways. And then there would be the reading of the will, a final message from beyond the grave, my father's last opportunity, to communicate his true feelings. What would his final testament reveal about the man behind the ambition, about the father behind the exacting standards? What financial provisions would reflect his ultimate assessment of his daughter's worth? As I sat there under the foreign stars, I realized I was approaching this return to Chicago as I had approached every challenge in my life, braced for evaluation, prepared to measure my value through someone else's estimation. Even in death, my father maintained this power over me. But as the plane carried us across the Atlantic the next day, a new thought began to form. Tentative at first, then gaining clarity and strength. Whatever awaited me in Chicago, whatever revelations emerged at the reading of the will, they could only hurt me if I continued to seek validation from sources that had consistently withheld it. Perhaps, I thought, as the coastline of America came into view below us, it was time to finally fully release that need. Perhaps the greatest inheritance I could claim was not whatever my father had allocated in his will, but the freedom to define my worth on my own terms. This journey home, I realized, might be about more than saying goodbye to my father. It might be about saying goodbye to the daughter who had spent a lifetime seeking a love that always came with conditions attached. My parents skipped my wedding for my sister's promotion. What happened at the reading of the will? Chicago welcomed me back with painful familiarity. The particular quality of light reflecting off Lake Michigan, the architectural silhouettes that had formed the backdrop of my formative years, the precise angle of late afternoon shadows across the downtown streets. All of it struck me with unexpected force, as though the city itself were a memory made physical. Our taxi from O'Hare navigated through neighborhoods that measured the chapters of my life, past Northwestern's campus where I'd earned my undergraduate degree, through Lincoln Park where James and I had begun our marriage, alongside the river, where my father had once pointed out Reed Manufacturing's first facility, now dwarfed by gleaming corporate towers. "Where to first?" James asked quietly, his hand covering mine in the back seat. "Your mother's house?" I shook my head. "The hotel. I need time to prepare before seeing them." We had reserved rooms at the peninsula, choosing the neutral territory of a downtown hotel rather than staying at my parents' suburban home. The distance was both physical and symbolic. I was returning as an adult with my own established life, not as the dutiful daughter slipping back into old patterns. After checking in, I stood at the window of our suite, watching the city transition from day to evening. Behind me, James unpacked our luggage with methodical care, giving me the space to process my thoughts. "Your mother called while you were in the shower," he said finally. "She wanted to know if we'd arrived safely." I turned from the window. "What did you tell her?" "That we'd check in with her tomorrow morning before the funeral." He studied my face. "Was that all right?" I nodded, grateful once again for his intuitive understanding of what I needed. "Yes, thank you." That night, I slept fitfully, dreams blending with memories in disorienting ways. My father appeared as he had been in my childhood, tall and Imposing, his voice carrying that particular tone of assessment that had always made me straighten my posture. In the dream, he was reviewing a report I had prepared, his fountain pen making decisive marks on the pages. "Almost right," he said, the familiar refrain of my youth. But not quite there yet. I awoke at 4 a.m., the hotel room disorienting in its anonymous luxury. James slept peacefully beside me, untroubled by the ghosts that had chased me from sleep. I slipped from the bed and moved to the sitting area, wrapping myself in the plush hotel robe. From my briefcase, I withdrew the folder of documents that the attorney had emailed: funeral arrangements, preliminary estate information, procedural details for the days ahead. My father, ever the efficient businessman, had left detailed instructions for his own death. The funeral service would be brief and non-religious. Former business associates would speak about his professional legacy. The family would host a reception afterward at the Reed family home. The morning of the funeral dawned clear and cool, a perfect Chicago spring day that seemed inappropriate for the occasion. I dressed carefully in a tailored black dress, pearl, earrings and the Cartier watch that had been my gift to myself when I made partner, armor of a sort, reminders of my independent success. "Ready?" James asked, adjusting his tie in the mirror. I met my own reflection behind his. The woman who looked back at me appeared composed, controlled, ready to face whatever the day might bring. Only I could see the uncertainty behind her eyes. "As I'll ever be," I replied. The first test came sooner than expected. As we entered the funeral home's private family room, my mother rose from a settee, Vanessa at her side. In the 20 months since I'd seen her, Eleanor Reed had aged visibly. Her carefully maintained appearance remained immaculate. Designer mourning clothes, perfectly styled silver hair, makeup applied with professional precision. But grief had carved new lines around her eyes and mouth. "Charlotte," she said, stepping forward with arms extended for an embrace that felt both mandatory and hollow. I allowed the contact without fully returning it. "Mom, I'm sorry about Dad." She held me at arm's length, her assessment as automatic as breathing. "You look well. London clearly agrees with you." "Thank you." I stepped back, creating space for James to offer his condolences. Behind my mother, Vanessa waited, uncertainty evident in her posture. The sisterly connection that had once been instinctive now required conscious navigation. "Vanessa," I said, moving toward her. "How are you holding up?" She shrugged, the gesture so reminiscent of our teenage years that it momentarily transported me back in time. It was sudden. "We're still in shock, I think." "When did it happen? The symptoms, I mean. Before." "He was at the office," she said. "Working late, as usual. The security guard found him when he didn't respond to calls. They said it was quick, that he probably didn't suffer." A bizarre comfort to think that my father had died as he had lived, focused on his business, pursuing the next achievement, uninterrupted by softer concerns. Our awkward reunion was interrupted by the funeral director announcing that guests were arriving. As immediate family, we would receive condolences in a receiving line before the service began. For the next 45 minutes, I stood beside my mother and sister, accepting handshakes and embraces from people who had populated my childhood: my father's business partners, my parents' social circle, distant relatives who had attended holiday gatherings and family celebrations. Many expressed surprise at seeing me, their comments revealing how completely I had disappeared from the family narrative during my time in London. "Charlotte, I didn't know you'd be here. How long has it been since you've been back to the States? Your mother mentioned you couldn't make it for Christmas last year, or was it the year before?" Each interaction reinforced what I had already suspected, that in my absence, I had been reduced to occasional mentions, My life condensed to the barest outlines shared when social obligations required some acknowledgement of my existence. The service itself proceeded exactly as my father would have wanted. The eulogies focused primarily on his business acumen, his vision for reed manufacturing, his contributions to the industry. When personal qualities were mentioned, they were the same ones valued in the corporate world: decisiveness, strategic thinking, unwavering standards. No one spoke of warmth or tenderness, of bedtime stories or fatherly advice, of the kind of love that comes without quarterly performance reviews attached. I listened to these tributes with a growing sense of disconnection, as though they were describing someone I had known professionally, rather than the man who had shaped my earliest understanding of what it meant to be valued. In the pew beside me, James held my hand, a silent anchor to the present as I drifted through memories of the past. The reception at my parents' home, my mother's home now, brought its own challenges. The house remained exactly as I remembered, it from the precisely arranged furniture to the framed achievements hanging in the study. It was a museum dedicated to a particular kind of success, each room curated to display the markers of a life well lived by exacting standards. As I moved through the crowded rooms, accepting condolences and making appropriate small talk, I found myself drawn to the family photographs arranged on the grand piano in the living room. Among them was a portrait taken at Vanessa's college. Graduation, my father standing proudly between his daughters, one arm around each of us, my mother elegant and composed beside him. We were all smiling, a perfect family tableau. What the photograph couldn't show was the conversation that had preceded it, my father's detailed critique of Vanessa's choice of major, his pointed questions about her post-graduation plans, the tension that had threatened to overshadow the celebration until I had skillfully redirected his attention to my own recent promotion. It couldn't capture how I had learned from the earliest age to manage my father's expectations, to shape myself into the daughter he wanted, rather than discover who I might have been without that constant pressure. It's strange to see it all again, isn't it? Vanessa's voice came from behind me, like stepping into a time capsule. I turned to find my sister holding 2 glasses of wine, offering one to me. "Thanks," I said, accepting both the drink and the overture it represented. "And yes, it's disorienting. I keep expecting Dad to come around the corner, asking why we're standing around when there are more productive uses of our time." Vanessa's laugh held genuine amusement tinged with old pain. "Remember how he used to call idle conversation inefficient social exchange? And weekends were potential productivity periods," I added, the shared memory creating a momentary bridge across the distance between us. We sipped our wine in companionable silence, watching the flow of mourners paying respects to my mother, who held court in the center of the room with practiced grace. "She's been different since it happened," Vanessa said, following my gaze. "Quieter, more reflective. I think she's reevaluating a lot of things." "Aren't we all?" I murmured. Vanessa studied me over the rim of her glass. "I heard your division at Meridian exceeded growth targets 3 quarters in a row. Impressive." "News travels," I observed, surprised by her awareness of my professional achievements. "Mom keeps tabs on you through the business press, has a Google alert set up for your name. She clips articles when you're mentioned." The revelation caught me off guard. She never mentioned that in her emails. There's a lot she doesn't mention. Vanessa shifted her weight, hesitating before continuing. "Look, Charlotte, about the wedding." I raised a hand to stop her. "It's in the past." "No, I need to say this." Her eyes, so similar to my own, held a determination I recognized. I should have pushed back harder about the ceremony date. Should have found a way to reschedule the promotion event. I knew how important your wedding was, and I let my own needs take priority. The apology, unexpected and unqualified, momentarily left me speechless. "I was jealous," she continued when I didn't respond. "Your whole life, You've been the standard I couldn't live up to, the perfect daughter who checked every box on Dad's success list. I finally had something that made them proud, that made them see me as valuable in the ways they understood value. And I wanted that moment. Needed it, maybe. Her candor deserved equal honesty in return. I never saw it that way, I admitted. From my perspective, you were the one who got their attention, their concern. I was left to succeed on my own because they knew I could, while you received support precisely because they worried you wouldn't. Vanessa's eyes widened slightly. That's not how it felt on my end. I'm beginning to think none of us experienced the same family, even though we lived in the same house. A small smile touched her lips. Subjective reality at its finest. The moment of connection was interrupted by the approach of my mother's closest friend, Barbara Hamilton, elegant. In understated black, her sympathy practiced and perfect. Charlotte, darling, how wonderful that you could make it back for your father. She air-kissed both my cheeks. Eleanor has been so worried about you, all alone in London. I'm hardly alone, I corrected gently. James is with me, and we have a full life there. Barbara waved this away as inconsequential. Well, perhaps this will bring you back more permanently. Families should be together, especially in times of loss. Before I could respond, she had moved on to Vanessa, dispensing more well-intentioned platitudes about family bonds and support systems. I caught my sister's eye over Barbara's shoulder, the shared look of exasperated understanding, another small bridge between us. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd gradually thinned. James found me in a quiet corner of the dining room, where I had retreated to collect myself. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice low and private. "Better than expected," I replied truthfully. "It feels not real yet, like I'm playing a part in someone else's drama." He nodded, understanding as always. "Your mother mentioned that the attorney will be here tomorrow morning at 10 for the reading of the will. She's asked if we'd stay at the house tonight." I tensed at the suggestion. "I'd rather go back to the hotel." "I thought you might say that." His smile held no judgment. "I already told her we have early calls to make given the time difference with London, but that we'll be here promptly at 9:30 tomorrow." Relief softened my shoulders. "Thank you." We made our goodbyes shortly after, promising to return the next morning. My mother embraced me again, this one feeling marginally more genuine than our earlier exchange. "We have much to discuss tomorrow," she said, an uncharacteristic uncertainty in her tone. "After the legal matters are settled." I nodded noncommittally. "We'll see you in the morning." The drive back to the hotel passed in contemplative silence, both James and I lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we were back in our suite, the formal constraints of the day finally lifted, that I allowed myself to fully process the emotions that had been building since our arrival. "It was strange," I said, removing my earrings and placing them carefully on the dresser. Standing there while people praised him, hearing all these tributes to his business genius, his leadership, his legacy. It was like they were talking about a corporate entity, not a father. James loosened his tie, watching me in the mirror. "What would you have said about him if you'd been asked to speak?" The question stopped me. What would I have said? What truth could I have offered about Richard Reed as a father, as a man who had shaped my understanding of love and worth? "I don't know," I admitted. "That he taught me the value of excellence? That he showed me how to set ambitious goals and exceed them? That he prepared me for a world that rewards achievement and has little patience for vulnerability?" I met my own reflection, searching for answers in my own eyes. That I spent my entire life trying to earn a love that should have been freely given? James came to stand behind me, his hands gentle on my shoulders. Maybe tomorrow will bring some closure. But as I prepared for bed that night, I found myself wondering what form that closure might take. What final message had my father encoded in his will? What value had he ultimately placed on his daughters? And how would that valuation be expressed? In his distribution of assets? Moreover, what did I hope to receive? Was it financial security I sought? Or something less tangible but far more valuable? Some posthumous acknowledgement of my worth beyond my productivity? Some evidence that, in the end, he had seen me as more than the sum of my achievements? As I drifted toward sleep, I recognized the familiar pattern emerging. Still seeking validation, still hoping for approval, still measuring my value through someone else's assessment. Even from beyond the grave, my father maintained this hold. On me, this power to determine my worth through his judgment. Tomorrow, I thought, as consciousness began to fade, would be my opportunity to finally break that pattern. Whatever the will revealed about my father's final estimation of his daughters, I would accept it without allowing it to define me. The time had come to claim an inheritance more valuable than any material bequest. The freedom to determine my own worth, independent of external validation or approval. With that resolution firmly in mind, I finally surrendered to sleep, preparing in dreams for the reckoning that awaited with the morning light. The morning of the will reading dawned with an unsettling brightness, as if the universe were deliberately contrasting my inner turmoil with perfect weather. I stood before the hotel window, watching Chicago come to life beneath a flawless blue sky. The city moved with familiar rhythms, oblivious to how this day would reshape my understanding of family, legacy, and self-worth. "Are you ready for this?" James asked, adjusting his tie in the mirror behind me. The question carried layers of meaning beyond the obvious. Was I ready to face my mother and sister in the formal setting of a will reading? Was I prepared for whatever financial decisions my father had encoded in his final testament? Most importantly, was I ready to receive his last communication without allowing it to define me? "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, smoothing my charcoal gray suit, a deliberate choice that projected confidence and composure. The fabric felt like armor against whatever revelations awaited. We arrived at my parents' home, my mother's home now, at precisely 9:27 a.m. My father's voice echoed in my memory. Early is on time is late. Even now, I couldn't bring myself to defy his standards. The house stood as it always had, a monument to carefully curated success. The immaculate Tudor exterior, the precisely maintained landscaping, the imported gravel driveway that crunched beneath our tires with aristocratic restraint, all of it designed to communicate achievement and control to anyone who approached. My mother opened the door before we could ring the bell, her appearance as meticulously managed as the property surrounding her. In her tailored black dress and pearls, with her silver hair arranged in its customary elegant twist, she embodied the dignified widow. Only the additional lines around her eyes and the slight tremor in her hand as she reached to embrace me betrayed the toll of recent days. "Charlotte, James, thank you for being prompt. Robert is already waiting in your father's study." She led us through the familiar hallways, past walls lined with evidence of Reed family accomplishments, diplomas in heavy frames, professional awards on illuminated shelves, photographs documenting handshakes with influential figures. My own achievements were represented, I noticed, though fewer than those of my father or, surprisingly, Vanessa. My sister was already seated in our father's study when we entered, perched nervously on one of the leather chairs positioned before the massive mahogany desk. She offered a tentative smile, which I returned with equal hesitation. Our brief connection at the funeral reception had eased some tension between us, but 2 decades of complex emotions couldn't be resolved with one vulnerable conversation. Robert Schwartz, my father's attorney for over 30 years, rose from behind the desk as we entered. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. He now occupied the position of authority, delivering judgments from the seat of power that had formerly belonged to my father. "Charlotte," he greeted me, extending his hand. It's been quite some time. I was pleased to hear of your success in London. I accepted his handshake, noting the familiar assessing quality in his gaze, measuring me against some invisible standard, just as my father had always done. Thank you, Robert. It's been a productive period. Indeed. He gestured to the remaining chairs. Shall we begin? I know you all have many matters requiring your attention. Once we were seated, James slightly behind me in a position that offered moral support without intrusion. Robert opened a leather portfolio and withdrew several documents. Before we proceed with the formal reading, he began, his voice taking on the measured cadence of legal proceedings, I want to express my personal condolences. Richard was not only my client, but a trusted friend, and a remarkable man whose guidance shaped many aspects of my own career. My mother nodded appropriately. Vanessa murmured a quiet, "Thank you." I remained silent, struck by the sudden realization that my father had been many things to many people, mentor, friend, business associate, roles that had revealed sides of his character I had never been privileged to see. The document I am about to read, Robert continued, represents Richard's final will and testament, revised and executed 11 months ago, replacing all previous versions. The timing registered immediately. 11 months ago, well after my wedding, after my move to London, after I had virtually severed communication with my parents. Whatever was contained in this document represented my father's final assessment of his daughters, made during a period of estrangement. I, Richard William Reed, being of sound mind and memory, do hereby make, publish, and declare this to be my last will and testament, hereby revoking any and all wills and codicils previously made by me. Robert moved through the standard legal preamble with practiced efficiency. Appointment of executors, my mother and, surprisingly, myself, provisions for the payment of debts, tax considerations, all delivered in the precise language of legal documents that transformed life's most emotional moments into orderly transactions. Then came the specific bequests. To my beloved wife, Eleanor Catherine Reed, I leave our primary residence at 487 Lakeside Drive, along with all furnishings and personal effects contained therein, the sum of $8 million, $8,000, to be transferred immediately upon my death, and a life interest in 40% of the Reed Family Trust, with quarterly distributions to be arranged according to the schedule outlined in Addendum A. My mother's expression remained unchanged, these provisions clearly matching her expectations. To my daughter, Vanessa Elizabeth Reed, I leave the summer property at Lake Geneva, including all furnishings and watercraft, the sum of $3 million, $3,000, and a 20% share in Reed Manufacturing, with voting rights to be exercised according to the shareholder agreement detailed in Addendum B. Vanessa's sharp intake of breath indicated her surprise. The Lake Geneva property had been my father's personal sanctuary, a place where he retreated to reflect on major business decisions. That he would leave it to Vanessa, artistic, environmentally conscious Vanessa who had rejected the corporate path he valued, seemed incongruous with everything I knew about him. Robert paused, taking a sip of water before continuing. The momentary silence amplified the tension in the room as we all waited to hear my portion of the inheritance. I felt James's reassuring presence behind me, his steady energy a counterbalance to my internal turmoil. To my daughter, Charlotte Ann Reed, I leave my personal library and collected papers, my investment portfolio currently managed by Meridian Capital, approximate value $12 million, and a 30% share in Reed Manufacturing, with voting rights as outlined in Addendum B. The disparity was immediately apparent, my inheritance substantially larger than Vanessa's, particularly the Reed Manufacturing shares. I glanced at my sister, concerned about her reaction, but her expression revealed only thoughtful consideration rather than jealousy or hurt. Furthermore, Robert continued, I established the Reed Innovation Fund with an initial investment of $20 million, $20,000, to be jointly administered by my daughters Charlotte and Vanessa, with the purpose of supporting entrepreneurial initiatives that demonstrate both commercial viability and positive social impact. This unexpected provision caused both Vanessa and me to look at each other in confusion. My father had never demonstrated significant interest in social impact, focusing instead on traditional metrics of business success. More surprising was the requirement for joint administration, forcing cooperation between sisters whose relationship had deteriorated to near estrangement. Additionally, Robert said, his tone shifting slightly, I have prepared personal letters for each member of my family to be read privately. And finally, there is a video recording that Richard instructed me to play at this gathering after the formal reading of the will. A video. My father, ever the strategic planner, had arranged to speak to us from beyond the grave. I felt a chill despite the room's comfortable temperature. Robert removed a slim laptop from his briefcase, opening it and positioning it so we could all see the screen. This was recorded approximately 10 months ago when Richard updated his estate plans. He was specific about its contents remaining private until this moment. With a few keystrokes, the screen illuminated, and suddenly my father appeared before us. He sat in this very study, in the chair Robert now occupied, looking remarkably healthy for a man who would suffer a fatal stroke less than a year later. He wore his customary business attire, a crisp white shirt, navy tie, no jacket, and regarded the camera with the direct gaze that had intimidated business competitors and family members alike throughout his life. If you're watching this, he began without preamble, then I am no longer with you, and Robert has just completed the reading of my will. Before you discuss the provisions I've outlined, I want to explain the reasoning behind certain decisions. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts, an uncharacteristic hesitation from a man who had always projected absolute certainty. Throughout my life, I have measured success in quantifiable terms: profit margins, market share, return on investment. I applied these same metrics to my family, believing I was preparing my children for a world that rewards achievement and punishes weakness. The familiar philosophy, delivered in my father's authoritative voice, transported me instantly back to childhood dinners where accomplishments were dissected and future expectations established with clinical precision. Recent events have forced me to reconsider this approach, he continued, and I felt a jolt of surprise. My father had never been one to reconsider anything once his mind was set. Charlotte's wedding. My breath caught at the direct reference. And the choices Eleanor and I made regarding that day have revealed flaws in my understanding of what truly constitutes success in family relationships. My mother shifted in her seat, her discomfort palpable as my father continued. Charlotte, your decision to distance yourself after our absence was painful but illuminating. It demonstrated a strength I had always valued in you, but directed toward self-preservation rather than external achievement. You prioritized your own well-being over maintaining family harmony at any cost, a lesson I might have benefited from learning earlier in life. His gaze seemed to fix directly on me through the screen, bridging time and mortality with unnerving directness. Vanessa, your persistence in pursuing work that creates positive change, despite my frequent dismissal of its value, has ultimately proven wiser than my narrow focus on financial returns. The metrics I used to measure success failed to capture the true impact of your contributions. My sister wiped away a tear, her expression a complex blend of grief and vindication. The provisions in my will reflect my belated recognition that I have been wrong about many things. The distribution of assets acknowledges both daughters' strengths while encouraging collaboration between your complementary perspectives. Charlotte's analytical rigor and Vanessa's visionary thinking, when combined, create something more valuable than either approach in isolation. He straightened in his chair, his posture reverting to the commanding presence I remembered from countless business discussions. The Reed Innovation Fund represents my attempt to bridge the values I spent a lifetime pursuing with the broader considerations I came to appreciate too late. It is my hope that this shared responsibility will also provide an opportunity to rebuild the sisterly bond that my parenting approach inadvertently damaged. The screen froze on my father's face for a moment before fading to black. In the silence that followed, I became aware of tears streaming down my own cheeks, tears I hadn't realized I was shedding. Robert closed the laptop gently. Your father revised his will and recorded this message shortly after a minor health scare, a warning sign that unfortunately wasn't sufficient to prevent the major stroke that took his life. He wanted to ensure his true intentions were clear, beyond the legal language of inheritance. My mother spoke first, her voice uncharacteristically vulnerable. Richard never discussed any of this with me. He simply said he was updating his estate plans as he did periodically. He struggled with direct emotional expression, Robert offered. This approach, structured, documented, precisely executed, was more comfortable for him than conversation. I recognized the truth in this assessment. My father had always communicated most clearly through actions rather than words, through strategic decisions rather than emotional revelations. This video and the accompanying will represent his final, most important strategic plan, a calculated attempt to repair what his lifetime of conditional approval had broken. As I looked around the study, I saw my father's legacy embodied in the people gathered there, my mother, whose partnership had been based on shared values of achievement and social position, my sister, whose rejection of those values had eventually earned reluctant respect, myself, who had excelled by his metrics while sacrificing authentic connection, and James, representing the different path I had begun to forge in London. The inheritance outlined in the will was substantial by any objective measure, but the true bequest, the recognition, however belated, that his definition of success had been fundamentally flawed, was far more valuable than any financial provision. For the first time since entering the house that morning, I felt the constriction in my chest begin to ease. My father's final message hadn't erased the pain of the past, but it had acknowledged it. He hadn't been able to change in life, but he had attempted to correct his legacy in death. Whether this posthumous insight was sufficient foundation for rebuilding what had been broken remained to be seen. But it offered something I hadn't expected to receive. Not the validation I had spent a lifetime seeking, but something more precious. The possibility of liberation from that need entirely. The silence that followed my father's video message expanded to fill every corner of the study. Each of us seemed suspended in private reflection, processing the unexpected vulnerability from a man who had always presented certainty as his defining characteristic. Through the window, sunlight continued its indifferent journey across the oriental rug, measuring time that suddenly felt elastic and strange. Robert was the first to break the silence, his professional demeanor providing a welcome return to practicality. There are several documents requiring signatures today, primarily acknowledging receipt of the will's contents and initiating the transfer processes. However, these can wait for a few minutes if you'd prefer some time to discuss privately. My mother straightened in her chair, composure flowing back into her posture like water finding its natural level. That won't be necessary. We're all professionals here. Let's proceed with the necessary paperwork. Her response was so characteristic, prioritizing efficiency over emotional processing, that I almost smiled. Some patterns remained unchanged, even in the aftermath of revelation. For the next 40 minutes, we moved through the bureaucracy of inheritance, signing documents, initialing amendments, providing bank information for transfers. The mundane details of wealth redistribution created a buffer zone, allowing us to adjust to the new reality my father's message had created without immediately confronting its more profound implications. When Robert finally closed his portfolio, and began returning documents to his briefcase. The protective structure of legal procedure dissolved, leaving us to face each other without its shield. "I've prepared everything you'll need regarding the Reed Innovation Fund," he said, handing identical folders to Vanessa and me. "The formal structure allows for significant flexibility in implementation. Richard was explicit that the specific initiatives should reflect your combined vision rather than predetermined criteria." Another posthumous message, my father relinquishing control, encouraging collaboration between daughters whose relationship had fractured, partly due to his differential treatment of them. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Thank you, Robert," I said, accepting the folder. "We'll review these details carefully." "Of course." He clasped his briefcase shut with a definitive click. "I'll be available for any questions that arise. Eleanor knows how to reach me at any time." My mother walked him to the door, leaving Vanessa, James, and me alone in the study. The absence of Robert's professional buffer immediately heightened the tension in the room. "Well," Vanessa said eventually, tapping her folder against her palm, "that was unexpected." "Which part?" I asked. "The uneven distribution of assets or Dad's 11th-hour revelation that his entire value system might have been flawed?" James placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, a silent reminder to temper the edge in my voice. I hadn't realized how much bitterness still lingered beneath the surface of my composed exterior. Vanessa didn't rise to the provocation. "All of it, honestly. I've spent my entire adult life believing Dad saw my career choices as disappointing, at best and embarrassing at worst. To hear him acknowledge value in my work." Her voice caught momentarily. "It's a lot to process." The vulnerability in her expression diffused my defensive posture. "I'm sorry, that was unnecessarily sharp." "But understandable," she conceded. "This isn't exactly a normal situation." "No," I agreed. "It certainly isn't." My mother returned, her footsteps announcing her approach before she appeared in the doorway. "Robert will send digital copies of all documents by this evening." She surveyed us with the assessing gaze I knew so well, the look that had evaluated my test scores, my college applications, my professional achievements throughout my life. "I've asked Teresa to prepare lunch. We should discuss next steps regarding the company shares in this innovation fund your father has established." The return to practical concerns was so predictable that Vanessa and I exchanged a knowing glance. Some things never changed, including our mother's instinct to channel emotional complexity into actionable items. "Actually," James interjected with gentle firmness, "I think Charlotte and I need some time to process everything we've learned today. Perhaps we could reconvene tomorrow for those discussions." I squeezed his hand in silent gratitude for the intervention. The prospect of immediately diving into business negotiations, without space to absorb the emotional import of my father's final message, felt overwhelming. My mother looked momentarily taken aback, unaccustomed to having her suggested agenda questioned. "I suppose that would be acceptable. Shall we say 11 tomorrow morning? I'll have my assistant clear my schedule." Even in grief, Eleanor Reed operated with executive efficiency. "That works for us," I confirmed. "Vanessa?" My sister nodded. "I'll rearrange some calls." As we prepared to leave, my mother disappeared briefly into the adjacent room, returning with a sealed envelope. "Your father's letter to you," she explained, holding it out to me. "Robert gave them to me for distribution." I accepted the envelope, noting my name written in my father's distinctive handwriting, precise capital letters, slightly angled to the right, executed with the fountain pen he had carried throughout his professional life. The personal nature of this communication, contrasted with the public declaration of the video, created a conflicted anticipation. What additional message had he reserved for my eyes alone? "Thank you," I said, slipping the envelope into my handbag without opening it. This was a conversation with my father that required privacy and preparation. Vanessa walked us to the door, lingering in the foyer after our mother had retreated to her study. "Do you want to get coffee tomorrow before the meeting?" she asked, the casual suggestion belying its significance. An overture toward reconnection, a step toward the collaboration our father had envisioned. I hesitated, old caution warring with new possibility. "That would be good," I said finally. "There's a cafe on Michigan Avenue I used to like, still there last time I checked." "Blackwood's? With those ridiculous oversized muffins?" The shared memory. Countless Saturday mornings during our college years, comparing notes on classes and boyfriends over coffee and baked goods, created an unexpected bridge across the years of distance. "That's the one. 9:30? I'll be there." She shifted her weight, hesitating before adding, "For what it's worth, Charlotte, I really am sorry about the wedding. Not just because Dad apparently had some revelation about it, but because it was wrong. You shouldn't have had to stand alone on your wedding day." The directness of her apology, unqualified by excuses or explanations, caught me off guard. "Thank you," I said simply, recognizing the effort it represented. "That means a lot." In the car driving back to the hotel, James waited for me to break the contemplative silence that had settled between us. He understood my need to process complex emotions before articulating them, one of the many reasons our partnership worked so well. "He knew," I said finally, staring out at the familiar Chicago skyline. "He knew they had hurt me, knew the damage their absence had caused, not just to my wedding day, but to my fundamental sense of value in their eyes." "Yes," James agreed quietly. He knew. But he couldn't say it to my face, couldn't pick up the phone, couldn't write an email, couldn't make any attempt to repair things while he was alive. He had to orchestrate this elaborate posthumous revelation instead. "Some people can only face certain truths when they know they won't have to deal with the aftermath," James observed. "Your father strikes me as someone who found vulnerability extremely difficult." I laughed without humor. "That's an understatement. In the Reed household, emotional needs were treated as weaknesses to be overcome, not legitimate aspects of human experience." And yet, James noted, his final message was essentially emotional. He was trying, in his way, to acknowledge what he'd come to understand. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Something. Yes, that was the heart of it. Not everything I might have wanted. Not the father who could express unconditional love directly. Not the parents who would prioritize my milestone moments over practical considerations. But something. An acknowledgement, however belated, that their choices had consequences. A recognition, however posthumous, that their value system had been flawed. Was it enough? Could any deathbed revelation, or post-deathbed in this case, truly compensate for decades of conditional approval and emotional absence? Back in our hotel suite, I placed my father's unopened letter on the desk and stood looking out at the city spread below us. Chicago had been the backdrop for the formative chapters of my life, my education, my early career, my engagement to James. Now it was the setting for this unexpected epilogue to my relationship with my father, a coda composed in his absence. "Are you going to read it?" James asked, gesturing toward the letter. "Not yet," I decided. "I need to sit with everything we learned today first. The letter isn't going anywhere." He nodded, understanding as always. "What about tomorrow?" "Coffee with Vanessa, then the business meeting with your mother. Are you ready for that?" It was a valid question. For nearly 2 years, I had maintained careful distance from my family, protecting myself from further disappointment by limiting contact to the most basic exchanges. Now I was contemplating not only renewed personal connection, but also a business partnership that would require ongoing collaboration. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to sign whatever documents are necessary to collect my inheritance, and get back on a plane to London without entangling myself in any Reed family dynamics again. The Innovation Fund is the complication." Because it forces you to work with Vanessa? Partly that, but also because it represents something my father apparently came to value at the end of his life: the integration of profit and social impact. If I dismiss it as too complicated, or too entangling, am I also dismissing that evolution in his thinking? James considered this, giving the question the serious reflection it deserved. Maybe there's a middle path. You could establish the fund with Vanessa as your father wished, set up governance structures that allow for some distance in daily operations, and still honor both his intention and your need for boundaries. The suggestion offered a glimpse of possibility, a way to respect my father's final wishes without sacrificing the independent life I had built. I reached for the hotel notepad and began jotting ideas, the familiar action of strategic planning providing comfort amid emotional uncertainty. As evening fell, we ordered room service rather than venture out into the city. Neither of us felt prepared for the inevitable encounters with former colleagues or family friends that dining in downtown Chicago would entail. The questions would be predictable. How long are you in town? When are you moving back? Surely you can't intend to stay in London permanently? And I lacked the energy to navigate them. After dinner, I found myself drawn back to the sealed envelope containing my father's letter. Whatever message it held represented his final direct communication to me, words chosen specifically for his eldest daughter, without the mediating presence of the attorney, or the knowledge that others would be listening. "I think I'm ready. Now?" I said, picking up the envelope. James squeezed my shoulder gently. "Do you want privacy?" I shook my head. "No. Stay." With careful movements, I broke the seal and extracted a single sheet of my father's personal stationery, heavy cream, paper embossed with his initials, a detail that brought an unexpected wave of sensory memory. The sight of his handwriting, the same authoritative script that had marked my childhood report cards with notes about areas for improvement, caused my heart to beat faster. "Charlotte, if you're reading this, I've failed to do what I should have done in person. Acknowledge the ways in which my approach to fatherhood has damaged our relationship. There are professional skills I mastered over decades of business leadership, but emotional courage has never been among them. Your wedding day. I made the wrong choice. Not a strategic miscalculation or a logical error, but a moral failing. In prioritizing Vanessa's professional recognition over your marriage ceremony, I validated your lifelong suspicion that achievement was the only currency of value in my eyes, that you needed to earn what should have been freely given, a father's support on a day of profound significance. The truth, which I've never adequately expressed, is that my expectations for you were higher precisely because your capabilities were so extraordinary. You seemed so self-sufficient, so naturally aligned with the values I understood, that I failed to recognize how this apparent alignment came at great personal cost to you. The distance you've maintained since that day represents healthy boundaries that I should respect, not breach. This letter is not an attempt to erase that boundary, but to acknowledge its legitimacy. You were right to protect yourself from a family dynamic that consistently undervalued your emotional needs while benefiting from your practical contributions. The financial provisions in my will reflect my recognition of your business acumen and strategic thinking. The Innovation Fund, however, represents something different, an opportunity, should you choose to accept it, to collaborate with your sister in creating something that neither of you could build alone. Whatever you decide, know that my final understanding, too late in coming, was that you were always enough, exactly as you were. The achievements were impressive, but unnecessary to earn what should have been unconditional. Your father, Richard Reed. I read the letter twice, then silently handed it to James. As he read, I tried to identify the emotions colliding within me. Grief, for the relationship that might have been had this understanding come earlier. Vindication that my perception of the family dynamic had been accurate. Lingering anger that this acknowledgement came posthumously rather than when reconciliation was possible. Most prominent, though, was a strange sense of liberation, My father's letter released me from the persistent doubt that I had overreacted to their absence at my wedding, that I had imposed unnecessary distance based on a single disappointment, rather than a pattern of conditional love. His words confirmed what I had felt but sometimes questioned during sleepless London nights, that my withdrawal had been a necessary act of self-protection, not a disproportionate response. "Well," James said finally, returning the letter to its envelope, "that's quite something." "Yes," I agreed. "It is. How are you feeling?" I considered the question carefully, resisting the impulse to offer a simplified response. Validated, sad, a little angry still, but also lighter somehow. Like I've been carrying this subconscious worry that I was the unreasonable one, that I had exaggerated the significance of what happened. His letter removes that doubt. James nodded. It's a profound acknowledgement, not perfect, but significant. "The question now," I said, returning to the planning that had always been my reflexive response to emotional complexity, "is what to do with it. How do I honor this belated recognition without abandoning the boundaries that have protected me?" "Maybe that's what tomorrow is about," James suggested. "Testing whether new terms of engagement are possible with your family, starting with coffee with Vanessa." He was right, of course. My father's posthumous insights, both public and private, had changed the landscape of our family relationships, but they couldn't dictate my response. That remained my choice. How much to engage, what boundaries to maintain, whether to collaborate on his final vision or create my own path forward. As I prepared for bed that night, I realized that this was perhaps my father's most valuable legacy. Not the financial assets or business shares, but this unexpected opportunity to reconsider relationships I had believed permanently damaged. His acknowledgement created possibility without demanding reconciliation, offered recognition without requiring forgiveness. For the first time since arriving in Chicago, I slept deeply and without dreams, my father's letter resting in its envelope. On the nightstand beside me, not a perfect resolution, but a bridge between what had been and what might yet be. Blackwood's Cafe hadn't changed since I'd last visited nearly 3 years ago. The same artisanal coffee scents mingled with freshly baked pastries. The weathered oak tables still bore the marks of countless laptops and coffee cups, and the morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating floating dust particles like microscopic constellations. It felt like stepping into a memory, familiar and foreign simultaneously. I arrived 15 minutes early, another inheritance, from my father who considered on time to be late. Selecting a corner table with good sightlines to the entrance, a habit from my consulting days when I'd prepare for client meetings, I ordered a cappuccino and waited, reviewing mental notes for the conversation ahead. When Vanessa walked through the door at precisely 9:28, 2 minutes ahead of our agreed time, I felt an unexpected flutter of nervousness. This wasn't a business meeting or a formal family obligation, but something more delicate, a tentative first step toward rebuilding what years of competition and misunderstanding had eroded. She spotted me immediately, raising a hand in acknowledgement before stopping at the counter to order. I studied her as she waited, noting both the familiar, the characteristic way she tucked hair behind her ear when speaking, and the unfamiliar, the confident posture that replaced her former defensive stance, the easy smile she exchanged with the barista. The sister I had known and the woman she had become while we were estranged existed simultaneously before me. "They still make those ridiculous muffins," she said by way of greeting, sliding into the chair opposite mine with a blueberry creation that resembled a small planet. "Some things never change." "While others change completely," I replied, the observation extending beyond pastries to the situation at hand. She nodded, understanding the subtext. Dad's final surprise act. Never thought I'd see the day when Richard Reed admitted he might have been wrong about something. "Let alone everything," I added, which drew a small laugh from her. We sipped our coffee in momentary silence, the awkwardness of our new circumstances settling around us. For decades, we had operated within the familiar framework of our family dynamic. Vanessa, the creative rebel, me, the achievement-oriented perfectionist, both of us competing for different forms of parental attention. Now that framework had been not only acknowledged as flawed, but posthumously dismantled by its primary architect. "Did you read your letter?" Vanessa asked finally, breaking the silence with characteristic directness. I nodded. "Last night. You?" "As soon as I got home yesterday." She tore a piece from her muffin without eating it, crumbling it between her fingers. Mine was not what I expected. The hesitation in her voice created an opening, an invitation to share what had once been private. "What did he say to you?" I asked gently. She met my eyes, weighing the question before answering. "He apologized for dismissing my career choices, for measuring my worth against standards that never aligned with my values. He said my persistence in pursuing meaningful work despite his disapproval demonstrated a strength of character he had only begun to appreciate after it was too late." The revelation of our father's parallel admissions struck me with unexpected force. "Mine was similar," I admitted. He acknowledged that missing my wedding was wrong, not a strategic miscalculation, but a moral failure, that he had demanded I earn what should have been freely given. Vanessa's eyes widened slightly. He used those exact words in my letter, too, about unconditional support being something we shouldn't have had to earn. Apparently his 11th hour epiphany was comprehensive, I observed, uncertain whether to find comfort or frustration in this evidence of our father's belated understanding. "Do you think he meant it?" Vanessa asked, voicing the question that had kept me awake despite my exhaustion. Or was this just his final strategic move, ensuring his legacy by smoothing over his mistakes? It was the core question, the one that would shape how we processed everything that had transpired. Had Richard Reed experienced genuine insight into his failings as a father, or had he simply executed one last meticulous business plan, creating the appearance of growth while controlling the narrative from beyond the grave? "I think," I said, carefully, "that he recognized the truth too late to change his behavior, but early enough to try influencing what came after him." Classic dad, acknowledging the problem but delegating the solution to someone else. A smile of rueful recognition crossed Vanessa's face. "And we're the delegated problem solvers." "Via the Innovation Fund," I agreed. $20 million, requiring us to collaboratively determine how best to blend profit motives with social impact. A reconciliation of our different value systems packaged as a business opportunity. "His final performance evaluation," Vanessa suggested, only half joking. The familiar framing, life as a series of assessments to be passed or failed, triggered something in me, a sudden resistance to perpetuating the mindset that had constrained us both for so long. "What if we refused to see it that way?" I proposed, surprising myself with the direction of my thoughts. What if, instead of approaching this as another test to pass or fail, we viewed it as an opportunity to define success on our own terms? Vanessa studied me with new interest. "You mean take the money but reject the implied obligation?" "Not exactly. More like, honor the intention while refusing to be bound by the dysfunctional patterns that shaped our family. We can create something meaningful without needing to prove ourselves worthy of the inheritance." As I articulated this perspective, I felt something shifting inside me, a loosening of the rigid framework that had structured my understanding of worth and achievement since childhood. The revelation felt simultaneously frightening and liberating. "That's not the Charlotte Reed approach I remember," Vanessa observed, curiosity replacing caution in her expression. "London has changed me," I admitted. Or perhaps more accurately, distance from the family dynamic has changed me. There's tremendous freedom in building a life where your value isn't constantly measured against impossible standards. Vanessa nodded slowly. I've experienced something similar these past few years at the foundation, working with people who value impact over status, collaboration over competition. It's been healing in ways I hadn't expected. The genuine connection in this exchange, the most authentic conversation we'd had in years, created an opening for the question that had been forming since yesterday's revelation. Do you think we could do it? I asked. Work together on this. Fund without falling back into old patterns? Create something that honors the best of what each of us brings rather than pitting those differences against each other? Vanessa considered this seriously, her analytical side. The part of her, most similar to me, though she'd rarely acknowledge it, visibly processing the complexities involved. It would require deliberate effort, she said finally, conscious awareness of those patterns so we could interrupt them, clear communication about triggers and boundaries, probably some external support structures. She smiled slightly. Fortunately, your husband is a therapist. The gentle teasing surprised a laugh from me. I'm not sure James would appreciate being volunteered as the Reed sisters' family systems counselor. Fair point, she conceded. But the sentiment stands. We'd need help navigating this. Neither of us had healthy models for resolving conflict or collaborating as equals. The pragmatic assessment, neither overly optimistic nor defeatist, resonated with my own thinking. We could start small, I suggested. Define the governance structure and basic parameters together, bring in trusted advisors for specific elements, create mechanisms for addressing disagreements before they escalate. Build the infrastructure before testing it with high stakes. Decisions, Vanessa translated, her project management experience evident in the framing. Exactly. As we discussed potential approaches, I felt an unexpected sense of possibility emerging. The Innovation Fund, my father's final strategic initiative, could become something neither he nor we had initially envisioned. Not just a vehicle for financial and social impact, but a framework for healing the relationship his parenting approach had damaged. Before we get too deep into planning mode, Vanessa said, interrupting my mental blueprinting, I need to say something directly. She squared her shoulders, meeting my eyes with characteristic forthrightness. I'm sorry about your wedding. Not because Dad had a deathbed revelation about it, but because it was wrong. You shouldn't have had to stand alone on your wedding day, and I contributed to that by not pushing harder to reschedule my event. The unqualified apology, offered without deflection or self-justification, caught me off guard. In our family culture, admitting error had always been treated as weakness rather than strength. Thank you, I said simply, recognizing the courage the statement required. That means a lot. She nodded, accepting the acknowledgement without pressing for reciprocal forgiveness. Another departure from our usual dynamics of transaction and obligation. We should probably head to Mom's soon, she noted, glancing at her watch. She'll have everything planned to the minute. Some things really don't change, I agreed, gathering my bag. As we prepared to leave, I added, whatever happens with the Innovation Fund, I'm glad we had this conversation. It feels like a beginning. A better beginning than we had the first time around, Vanessa observed with unexpected insight. Back then, we were competitors by default, positioned that way by circumstances beyond our control. Now we're making a conscious choice about what kind of relationship we want to build. Her framing struck me as profoundly true. For all his strategic brilliance, our father had failed to recognize how his approach to parenting had created unnecessary competition between sisters who might otherwise have been natural allies. Now, with that framework exposed and dismantled, we had the opportunity to discover what might be possible between us. The walk to our mother's house took us through familiar neighborhoods, past landmarks that had shaped our early lives. The park where we'd played as children, the library where I'd spent countless hours preparing for academic competitions, the ice cream shop where we'd celebrated Vanessa's first art award. Each location held memories of both connection and separation, reminders of a shared history experienced through divergent perspectives. "Do you think Mom knew?" Vanessa asked as we turned onto Lakeside Drive. "About Dad's change of heart, I mean." I considered the question, remembering my mother's surprised reaction to the video message. "No. I think this was something he kept to himself until the end. Typical. Dad, processing internally rather than risking a vulnerable conversation." "Poor Mom," Vanessa said with unexpected compassion. "Imagine discovering your husband of 40 years had fundamentally reconsidered his values after his death, with no opportunity to participate in that evolution." The observation revealed a capacity for empathy I hadn't fully appreciated in my sister. "I hadn't thought about it from that perspective," I admitted. "But you're right. This must be disorienting for her too, having the foundation of their partnership retrospectively questioned." As we approached the imposing Tudor facade of our childhood home, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The coming meeting with our mother would address the practical aspects of our inheritance: corporate shares, financial transfers, legal responsibilities. But the more significant work had already begun here, in the tentative reconnection between sisters who were discovering they might have more in common than they'd been raised to believe. Whatever came next would be neither simple nor painless. Decades of ingrained patterns wouldn't dissolve through one heartfelt conversation or a single posthumous revelation. But for the first time in years, I felt genuinely hopeful about the possibility of building something new from the complicated legacy our father had left behind. Not just a philanthropic fund with his name attached, but a different kind of family system, one founded on mutual respect rather than competitive achievement. As Vanessa rang the doorbell, I straightened my shoulders, preparing to face our mother with this new perspective. The greatest inheritance my father had unwittingly provided wasn't measured in dollars or company shares, but in the opportunity to redefine success on my own terms, and perhaps to build the authentic sisterhood that had always existed as potential beneath the surface of our carefully managed family performance. My mother opened the door before we could ring the bell a second time, her timing so precise it suggested she had been watching our approach through the living room window. Eleanor Reed stood framed in the doorway, elegant as always in a tailored, navy dress that managed to be both appropriate for morning and suitable for a business meeting, embodying the practical efficiency that had characterized her approach to all of life's challenges, including grief. "Right on time," she observed, stepping aside to let us enter. Her gaze flickered between us with subtle assessment, noting our arrival together rather than separately. "I trust your coffee was productive." The phrasing was so characteristic, transforming even casual social interaction into an opportunity for achievement, that Vanessa and I exchanged a quick glance of shared recognition. "It was illuminating," I replied, selecting my words with deliberate care. "We had a lot to discuss." "I'm sure you did." My mother led us through the foyer toward the formal dining room rather than my father's study, a departure from yesterday's arrangements that suggested a shift in power dynamics. James called to say he'll be joining us shortly. He had an urgent consultation with a London colleague. The information was delivered neutrally, but I caught the undercurrent of disapproval. In my mother's world, family business took precedence over professional obligations, regardless of time zones or client needs. That James had prioritized his work, even temporarily, represented a small rebellion against the Reed family hierarchy. The dining room table had been transformed into a command center, with neat stacks of folders, legal documents, and financial statements arranged with military precision. Robert Schwartz was already seated at what had traditionally been my father's position, his expression suggesting this placement had not been his choice. Beside him sat a younger man I didn't recognize, presumably another attorney from the firm. Charlotte, Vanessa, Robert greeted us, rising briefly. Allow me to introduce Matthew Patel, our firm's specialist in philanthropic governance. Given the complexity of the Innovation Fund's structure, I thought his expertise would be valuable. Today. The addition of this specialist confirmed my suspicion that the fund represented more than a simple bequest. It was a carefully constructed vehicle with specific intentions behind its design. My father's posthumous influence extending even further than I had initially realized. We took our seats at the table, the arrangement subtly different from our customary family positions. Throughout childhood and into adulthood, family meals had followed a consistent pattern. My father at the head, my mother at the foot, Vanessa and me on opposing sides. Today, with Robert occupying my father's former place, my mother had positioned herself adjacent rather than opposite, symbolically stepping into partnership with the executor rather than maintaining the traditional separation between parental authorities. Before we begin the formal business, my mother said once we were settled, I want to address yesterday's revelations. Her hands clasped together on the table, knuckles whitening slightly, the only visible sign of emotional tension in her otherwise composed demeanor. Richard's video message contained perspectives he never shared with me during our marriage. The admission hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. My father, who had built his business reputation on strategic transparency and clear communication, had kept his evolving personal insights from the woman who had been his partner for over 4 decades. When did you first learn about the changes to his will? I asked, curiosity overcoming my usual reticence. Yesterday morning, she replied, meeting my gaze directly. Robert brought the video to my attention just before your arrival. Richard had instructed that it remain sealed until the formal reading. Another strategic withholding, another calculated posthumous revelation. The pattern was becoming clearer, my father orchestrating a series of discoveries from beyond the grave, controlling the narrative even in death. That must have been difficult, Vanessa said, her voice gentler than I had expected. Learning about such a significant shift in his thinking with no opportunity to discuss it. My mother's expression softened slightly at this unexpected empathy. It was surprising. In 43 years of marriage, Richard rarely questioned his foundational values. Certainly never to this extent. The conversation paused as James was shown into the room, his presence bringing a welcome neutrality to the charged family dynamic. He took the seat beside me, his hand briefly covering mine beneath the table, a silent communication of support that centered me instantly. Now that we're all present, Robert said, assuming control of the meeting with practiced efficiency, let's proceed with the business at hand. Eleanor has been briefed on the general structure of Richard's bequests, but there are specific decisions requiring immediate attention. For the next hour, we moved through a carefully orchestrated discussion of assets, transfers, and responsibilities. My inheritance, the investment portfolio, the 30% stake in Reed Manufacturing, various smaller holdings, was detailed with precise valuations and tax implications. Vanessa's portion, the Lake Geneva property, her 20%, company stake, some art collections I hadn't known my father possessed, received similar treatment. Throughout this recitation of material wealth, I found my attention repeatedly drawn to my mother, watching her reactions as the full scope of my father's estate planning decisions became clear. She maintained her composure with characteristic discipline, but small tells, a tightening around her eyes when the Innovation Fund was mentioned, a slight pursing of her lips during discussion of the company voting structures, revealed her ongoing adjustment to these unanticipated arrangements. Now, regarding the Reed Innovation Fund, Robert said, turning to the portion of the agenda that most directly connected Vanessa and me. Richard was explicit about its governance structure. While he provided general guidelines regarding its purpose, supporting ventures that balance commercial viability with positive social impact, He intentionally left the specific investment criteria to be determined jointly by his daughters. Matthew Patel, the philanthropy specialist, opened his portfolio. Mr. Reed designed the fund with unusual flexibility, he explained. Most founders establish detailed parameters for how their philanthropic vehicles operate. Here, he created a framework but explicitly delegated the strategic decisions to the two of you, with provisions for resolving potential disagreements. The deliberate nature of this design struck me anew. My father creating a mechanism that would require ongoing collaboration between sisters, whose relationship had fractured partly due to his differential treatment of them. Whether this represented genuine insight into the damage his parenting approach had caused, or simply another strategic control mechanism remained ambiguous. What exactly are these provisions for resolving disagreements? Vanessa asked, zeroing in on the practical implications. Matthew extracted a document from his folder. In cases where unanimous agreement cannot be reached, the fund's bylaws establish a deliberation process involving a third-party mediator selected from an approved list. If mediation fails, the disputed matter is referred to a 3-person advisory board consisting of one appointee from each of you and a third member selected jointly. Elaborate checks and balances, I observed. Dad didn't leave much to chance. On the contrary, Robert interjected, by establishing a framework for productive disagreement rather than mandating specific outcomes, Richard created substantial space for genuine collaboration. The structure acknowledges the possibility of conflict while preventing deadlock. The assessment was surprisingly insightful, highlighting an aspect of my father's design I hadn't fully appreciated. He hadn't simply thrown us together and demanded cooperation. He had created sophisticated mechanisms to support that cooperation without predetermining its content. The approach reflected both his strategic thinking and, perhaps, a belated recognition that his daughters deserved autonomous decision-making authority rather than rigid paternal directives. As the discussion continued, exploring tax implications, reporting requirements, and administrative structures, I found my perspective shifting. What had initially felt like posthumous manipulation, my father orchestrating reconciliation from beyond the grave, began to appear more nuanced. The Innovation Fund offered genuine opportunity without demanding performative harmony. It created a shared project while respecting our individual strengths and perspectives. There's one additional element, Robert said, turning to the final page of his agenda. Richard established a separate personal account for each of you, distinct from your primary inheritances. He described these as unconditional gifts in his notes, with no restrictions or expectations attached. The attorney slid identical envelopes across the table to Vanessa and me. Inside mine was a bank card and account information for a sum that, while modest compared to the primary inheritance, represented significant personal freedom. Financial resources entirely disconnected from performance metrics or strategic objectives. The symbolism wasn't subtle. A posthumous attempt to provide what had been withheld in life, support without conditions, value without measurement. The gesture simultaneously acknowledged the damage done by years of conditional approval and attempted, however imperfectly, to begin its repair. One final matter, Robert continued after we had reviewed these documents. Richard left instructions regarding his personal effects, books, papers, artifacts from his office. Charlotte, he specifically wished for you to review these materials before any decisions were made about their disposition. He indicated they contain insights that might prove valuable, particularly regarding the early history of Reed manufacturing. This bequest, access to my father's private papers and personal library, carried implications beyond its material value. It represented an invitation to understand him more fully in death than had been possible in life, to explore the thinking behind decisions that had shaped our family's trajectory for decades. Of course, I agreed, uncertain whether to view this task as opportunity or obligation. When would be appropriate to begin that review? At your convenience, my mother interjected, speaking for the first time in nearly an hour. His study remains as it was. Nothing has been removed or rearranged. The preservation of my father's workspace as a kind of memorial revealed something about my mother's processing of her loss. Maintaining physical proximity to the husband whose internal evolution had apparently occurred without her knowledge or participation. With the formal business concluded, an awkward moment followed as we all recognized the transition from legal procedures to more personal territory. Robert and Matthew gathered their documents, preparing to leave us to the family, discussions that would inevitably follow. "Before you go," my mother said, her voice taking on an unexpected note of authority, "I'd like to address something directly." She turned to face Vanessa and me across the table. "Your father's video message yesterday suggested that our parenting approach, particularly his, created unhealthy dynamics between you. That our emphasis on achievement and excellence damaged your relationship as sisters." The blunt assessment of an issue we had only begun to discuss privately caught me off guard. While Vanessa and I had acknowledged these patterns during our coffee conversation, having them named so explicitly by our mother, who had been an equal participant in establishing those dynamics, created a different kind of reckoning. "I've spent the past 24 hours reflecting on this perspective," she continued, her composure intact but something vulnerable entering her expression. "Examining decisions made and priorities established throughout your childhoods and into adulthood. Reviewing moments when Richard and I reinforced competition rather than cooperation, when we measured your worth by metrics that may have been limited in their scope." The attorneys exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly wishing to be excused from this unexpectedly personal turn in the conversation. "Perhaps we should reconvene after lunch," Robert suggested diplomatically. "Give the family some privacy, too?" "That won't be necessary," my mother interrupted with characteristic decisiveness. "What I have to say is relevant to the legal matters at hand, particularly regarding the Innovation Fund." She waited until Robert reluctantly settled back into his chair before continuing. "The structure your father created, requiring collaboration between daughters whose strengths he had historically positioned as oppositional, represents genuine insight on his part. Insight that came too late for him to implement in life, but that he attempted to encode into his legacy." Her assessment aligned with my own evolving understanding of my father's intentions, but hearing it articulated by my mother, who had been his partner in establishing the family dynamics he ultimately questioned, carried additional weight. "What I wish to add," she said, her gaze moving between Vanessa and me with unusual directness, "is my own acknowledgement of responsibility." While Richard's video focused on his personal reflections, the patterns he identified were ones we established together. The emphasis on individual achievement over mutual support, the implied competition for parental approval, the different standards applied to each of you, these weren't solely his creation. The admission, unqualified and direct, represented a departure from my mother's typical approach to family matters. Throughout our childhoods, she had been the diplomatic counterbalance to my father's more explicit judgments, softening his critiques while nevertheless reinforcing the underlying value system that produced them. "I don't say this to burden you with additional emotional processing during an already complex transition," she clarified, "rather to affirm that whatever path you choose regarding the Innovation Fund and your relationship moving forward, you do so with my full recognition that the foundation you're building upon was flawed in significant ways." The statement hung in the air, its implications rippling through the carefully ordered proceedings of the morning. My mother had not only acknowledged the dysfunctional patterns my father posthumously recognized, she had claimed equal ownership of their creation and impact. In doing so, she had shifted from defender of the established family system to potential ally in its reconstruction. "Thank you," Vanessa said simply, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her eyes. "That couldn't have been easy to say." My mother inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement. It wasn't, but necessary truths rarely are. In that moment, observing the exchange between my sister and mother, I glimpsed the possibility of something I had long ago resigned myself to never experiencing, an authentic family relationship, based on honest recognition of both historical patterns and future potential, neither artificially maintained through performance, nor permanently severed through estrangement. Whether that possibility could be realized remained uncertain. Decades of entrenched dynamics wouldn't dissolve through a single conversation or even a series of posthumous revelations. But for the first time in years, I felt genuinely curious about what might emerge if we approached our relationships with the same deliberate intention my father had encoded into his estate planning, creating structures that acknowledged past failures while establishing frameworks for something different. As the meeting concluded and we prepared to move into the less formal lunch my mother had arranged, I found myself reflecting on the complex inheritance I was receiving. Not just material assets and business responsibilities, but a final opportunity to rewrite narratives that had constrained us all for far too long. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the walnut blinds of my father's study, casting linear shadows across the Persian rug where I now stood, key in hand, contemplating the bookshelf that concealed his secret archive. After my mother departed, for her foundation meeting, the house had fallen into a hushed silence, broken only by the distant sounds of Teresa tidying the kitchen. James had tactfully offered to work on some client notes in the garden room, giving me privacy for this intimate exploration. Third shelf, behind the Jefferson biography, my mother had instructed before leaving, pressing a small brass key into my palm. The journals are arranged chronologically. The combination is your birth date. Now, removing the leather-bound volume of Jefferson's collected works, I revealed a subtle seam in the wood paneling. My fingers traced the nearly invisible outline until I located the small keyhole, cleverly disguised as a decorative element in the shelf's carving. The lock turned with a soft click, and a panel swung outward to expose a wall safe with a digital keypad. I entered the numbers that marked my entrance into the world, 10-15-82, and heard the satisfying electronic beep of acceptance. The heavy door swung open, revealing not the expected stack of financial documents or legal papers, but row upon row of identical black leather journals, each embossed with a gold year designation on its spine. They stretched back to 1979, the year my father founded Reed Manufacturing, and continued through last December, just months before his death. 43 years of private reflections, 4 decades of thoughts never shared with colleagues, business, partners, or family. A chronicle of my father's inner life that none of us had been permitted to witness while he lived. With reverent hands, I removed the earliest volume, carried it to my father's desk chair, and settled into the worn leather that still seemed to hold the imprint of his posture. The first page bore a simple inscription in my father's precise handwriting. R.W. Reed, Personal Records Began. January 1st, 1979. The unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates. The philosophical quotation surprised me. My father had always presented himself as ruthlessly practical, dismissive of abstract thinking that didn't translate directly to actionable strategies. This glimpse of philosophical consideration challenged my understanding of his character from the very first page. As I began to read, my father's voice emerged with startling clarity. The entries from 1979 documented the fragile beginnings of what would become Reed Manufacturing, the precarious financing, the skeptical suppliers, the sleepless nights spent recalculating projections and revising business plans. His writing was more personal than I had expected, revealing vulnerabilities never displayed in his public persona. March 18, 1979. Second Bank rejected our loan application today. The loan officer, younger than me by at least 5 years, explained that our collateral was insufficient for the requested amount. What he meant, though he was too polite to say it directly, was that he doesn't believe in our potential. Another gatekeeper who can't see beyond conventional metrics to the opportunity we represent. Eleanor says we should approach regional banks instead of the major institutions. She's probably right, as usual. Her strategic instincts have always been sharper than mine, though she prefers to deploy them behind the scenes. Sometimes I wonder if she should be the one pitching to investors while I manage the operational details. But the world isn't ready for a woman to lead a manufacturing venture. At least not in this industry. Another limitation we'll have to work around rather than through. This casual acknowledgement of my mother's business acumen contradicted the narrative I had absorbed throughout childhood, that my father was the visionary, while my mother provided social connections and emotional support. Here was evidence of a more balanced partnership, of professional respect I had never witnessed in their public interactions. Turning the pages, I found myself increasingly absorbed in the chronicle of Reed Manufacturing's precarious early years. My father documented not just business decisions, but their emotional impact. The exhilaration of landing their first major contract, the despair when production problems threatened to derail delivery, the persistent anxiety about meeting payroll for the growing team that depended on him. By the time I reached entries from 1982, the year of my birth, the company had achieved tentative stability. My father's writing about my arrival revealed a tenderness I had never experienced directly. October 15th, 1982. Charlotte Ann Reed arrived at 3:42 this morning after 26 hours of labor. Eleanor showed extraordinary strength throughout, refusing pain medication until the final hours when the doctors insisted it was medically necessary. She embodies a grace under pressure that I can only aspire to emulate. Holding Charlotte for the first time produced a sensation I was entirely unprepared for, a fierce protectiveness coupled with overwhelming terror. This tiny person depends entirely on our competence, our decisions, our ability to prepare her for a world that offers both limitless opportunities and merciless challenges. The responsibility feels more consequential than any business contract or financial obligation I've ever undertaken. I want to give her everything: security, opportunity, the confidence that comes from never knowing scarcity. The memory of my own childhood, the constant financial uncertainty, my father's repeated failures, the humiliation of wearing second-hand clothes and accepting charity, feels freshly raw today. Charlotte will never experience that kind of vulnerability. I will make certain of it, whatever sacrifices that requires of me. The entry stunned me into stillness. In all my years, my father had never spoken of his childhood hardships. He had presented his success story as one of merit and determination, not as an escape from poverty and insecurity. This context cast his relentless ambition, his emphasis on achievement and financial success, in an entirely new light, not merely as values he prized, but as protective measures against vulnerabilities he had personally experienced. The door opened quietly and Vanessa appeared, hesitating at the threshold. Mom texted that you'd started reviewing Dad's journals. Is it okay if I join you? I nodded, still processing the revelations of those early entries. Of course, I've barely scratched the surface, but it's not what I expected. She approached, cautiously, taking in the open safe and the journal in my hands. What have you found so far? Context, I replied, struggling to articulate the shift occurring in my understanding. Dad writes about things he never mentioned to us: his childhood, poverty, Mom's contributions to the business, his anxieties about failing. It's like discovering a completely different person existed beneath the father we knew. Vanessa settled into one of the visitor chairs across from the desk. That tracks with what Mom said at lunch, about him having dimensions we weren't permitted to see. Listen to this, I said, turning to an entry from 1985. This is about you, just after you were born. May 4, 1985. Vanessa Elizabeth arrived yesterday, 3 weeks earlier than expected, but perfectly healthy according to the doctors. Charlotte seems fascinated by her sister, though we're monitoring their interactions carefully. At 2.5, she doesn't fully understand the concept of gentleness. With Vanessa's arrival, I find myself contemplating legacy in more concrete terms. 2 daughters to carry forward the Reed name, to benefit from the foundation Eleanor and I are building. The responsibility feels even more profound now, creating security not just for one child but for 2, establishing opportunities that will allow them both to thrive according to their individual capacities. The business is finally achieving sustainable profitability. The Miller contract exceeded projections by 18%, and the expanded production line is operating at optimal efficiency. These successes couldn't have come at a better time, with the increased expenses of a growing family. The educational trust funds are now established for both girls, the first step in ensuring they'll have every advantage I lacked. Eleanor disagrees with my approach to the trusts, arguing that too much security can undermine initiative. She may be right in principle, but I cannot bring myself to leave our daughters vulnerable to the economic uncertainties that defined my own childhood. We've compromised by structuring the funds to require educational achievement for full access, incentivizing excellence while providing essential support. Vanessa listened with rapt attention, her expression softening at this evidence of our father's early concern for our welfare. He established our college funds when I was literally days old. I always assumed those came later, when the company was well established. Apparently, securing our education was a priority from the beginning, I confirmed, equally surprised by this revelation. And did you catch the disagreement with Mom? She was the one advocating for less financial security, concerned it might undermine our initiative. That contradicts everything I assumed about their parenting philosophies, Vanessa said, shaking her head slightly. I always thought Dad was the hardliner about earning privileges while Mom was the softening influence. Same. I turned another page, scanning for significant entries. Their partnership was clearly more complex than they allowed us to see. For the next 2 hours, Vanessa and I pored over the journals from our early childhood years, discovering patterns and perspectives that challenged our long-held assumptions about our parents. My father documented family vacations, school achievements, and developmental milestones with surprising detail and occasional flashes of humor we had rarely witnessed in person. More revealing were his reflections on parenting approaches and the values he hoped to instill. August 12, 1988. Charlotte began first grade today, already reading at a third-grade level according to her assessment. Her academic capabilities continue to exceed expectations, though her perfectionism concerns me. She dissolved into tears last week when her drawing didn't match her vision, refusing to continue until Eleanor patiently guided her through techniques for correcting perceived errors. I recognize this tendency all too well, the paralysis that comes from setting impossible standards, the fear of failure that can prevent appropriate risk-taking. It's a trait I've struggled to manage in myself throughout my career, one that has simultaneously driven achievement and limited innovation at crucial junctures. How do we teach her to harness the positive aspects of this orientation while mitigating its potential to undermine happiness and creativity? Eleanor suggests more unstructured play, opportunities to experiment without evaluation. I worry this approach might fail to prepare her for a world that rewards results rather than effort. We continue to debate the optimal balance, the insight into my father's awareness of my perfectionism and his recognition of it as a potentially limiting trait rather than an unqualified strength, challenged decades of assumptions about his values and expectations. Far from the unwavering advocate for achievement at all costs, these private reflections revealed a parent grappling with nuanced concerns about psychological development and long-term well-being. Entries about Vanessa showed equal complexity. April 3, 1991. Vanessa's art teacher called today to discuss her exceptional creative talents and recommend additional enrichment opportunities. Eleanor is enthusiastic, already researching weekend programs at the Art Institute. I find myself hesitant, concerned about diverting focus from academic foundations that will provide more reliable paths to security and success. Yet I can't deny the transformation that occurs when Vanessa engages with creative projects, a focus and determination that far exceeds her approach to conventional schoolwork. Perhaps this represents her unique avenue toward the excellence and mastery I want for both our daughters, albeit through a direction I struggle to fully value given my own experiences. My father dismissed my early interest in engineering as impractical dreaming. I vowed never to repeat that mistake with my own children. Am I now imposing equally limited vision on Vanessa by privileging traditional academic achievement over artistic development? The parallels are uncomfortably apparent when examined objectively. Vanessa looked up from the page, her eyes bright with unshed tears. He was questioning his response to my art interests even back then? I always thought he saw them as frivolous, distractions. He was struggling with it, I acknowledged, equally moved by this evidence of internal conflict we had never been permitted to witness. Trying to reconcile his protective instincts about financial security with recognition of your authentic strengths. As we continued reading, a more complex portrait of our father emerged, a man whose external certainty masked significant internal questioning, whose stern expectations coexisted with genuine concern for our well-being, whose rigid value system contained more nuance than he had ever allowed us to perceive. Most strikingly, his private reflections revealed awareness of the dynamics between Vanessa and me, and his growing recognition of his role in shaping them. June 18, 1996. The girl's relationship concerns me increasingly. At 13, Charlotte has adopted the evaluative mindset that serves her so well academically, but creates distance from her sister. Vanessa, at 11, alternates between seeking Charlotte's approval and deliberately rejecting her standards through contrarian choices. Eleanor suggests this is normal sibling differentiation, but I recognize the influence of our parenting approaches. We've emphasized Charlotte's analytical strengths while attempting to channel Vanessa's creative tendencies toward practical applications. The unintended consequence has been positioning them as representatives of competing value systems rather than complementary strengths within the family. How do we correct this trajectory without undermining the confidence both have developed in their respective capacities? The business principle of specialized roles contributing to unified purpose seems applicable, yet more challenging to implement in family dynamics than corporate structures. He saw it, Vanessa said softly. Even then, he recognized how their approaches were driving us apart instead of fostering collaboration. But he never addressed it directly, I noted, the familiar disappointment surfacing despite these revelations. He documented the insight but didn't change his behavior. Classic dad, Vanessa agreed with a sad smile. Excellent at diagnosis, inconsistent on implementation when it involved emotional rather than strategic adjustments. The afternoon light had shifted to the golden hues of approaching sunset by the time we reached the journal entries from the period surrounding my wedding, the event that had crystallized the family dynamics in their most damaging form. With trepidation, I located the volume covering that time frame and turned to the relevant dates. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.